Welcome to the Fredi, Schiff, Levin lecture series, which is now in its 18th year and graciously sponsored by the Levin family. We honor Fredi's legacy as a member of the Provincetown arts community by inviting artists, curators, authors, and scholars to speak at PAAM. We extend our gratitude to the Levin family and to Amy Davies and Provincetown Television for filming the series. Thank you for joining us online. During the talk, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the session. And if you can, please write in the chat box where in the world you're joining us from today. Tonight, we're welcoming Josephine Halvorson, an American contemporary painter, sculptor, and printmaker based in Massachusetts. She was born right here on Cape Cod in Brewster and studied at the Cooper Union, Yale Norfolk, and Columbia University. She was awarded a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship this year and is best known for her on-site paintings, drawings from scenes of the natural world and everyday life. Welcome, Josephine.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Leslie. And thank you, Amy and Provincetown TV, the Provincetown Art Association and Museum, and everyone who's watching and taking time out of their lives to tune in. I really appreciate it. I am also grateful for this talk that it coincides with my exhibition at GA Gallery on Commercial Street, which is up through August 2nd. And I'll be there on July 30th for an artist reception alongside Esteban Cabeza de Baca, who has an extraordinary solo show adjacent to mine. And so I just wanted to thank Bettina, Erin, Alexandra, and Esteban. And if you'd like to learn more, check out GA's website or my own, although it might not be updated. And also an article that came out by Susanna Fulcher in the Provincetown Independent, which was great, and I really enjoyed speaking with her. So yeah, tonight the Provincetown is a very special place for me. As Leslie mentioned, I grew up on Cape Cod, and I studied art in Provincetown. It's some of the first experiences I had learning how to paint and how to make paintings, and which I've been doing ever since. So it's a very special place. Also in my family. Behind me is a piece by my father from 1967, which assembled a number of found objects and debris that he likely collected from the beaches of the Cape and reassembled in this piece. So what I'll do this evening is I'm going to give you an overview of my recent work, and then I will share a bit about my education on the Cape. I pulled out some archival images and different ephemera from that time that I thought might be interesting for you to see. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and begin my presentation. Also, I think Leslie might have mentioned this, but if you do have questions, put them in the chat, and at the end, she'll read them to me, and I'd be happy to answer them. All right. So this is this recent body of work I mentioned that I'll be discussing tonight, and it primarily centers around the ground, land, evidence, and preservation. This is what I've been doing the last few years. And it does not include more recent work, however, since basically the pandemic. So, however, this body of work does include the 5 paintings which are on view at GA Gallery. This is a photograph of my feet. I've made work that is, I think we would call site-specific, that takes place on location or on site for a number of years prior to these bodies of work that I'm about to share with you. But it's always included a degree of trespass, of being well, wherever I am, really, it has meant that I have to be there to make the painting, and that means that I'm often really on someone else's land. And when I returned to Massachusetts in 2016, where I live now in the Berkshires, after having lived in Europe and New York City, and many different places, and also making work on the road for the better part of a decade, where I was kind of traveling around. It was when I returned to New England and to Massachusetts in particular that I started noticing what it felt like to be home, or what home meant, and what belonging means. It was also the first time that I owned my own land. So after years of making paintings on other people's property, I was starting to consider what it meant to make them on my own. And I started finding these traces of previous owners of the land. I started noticing the ways that claims were made on natural forms like trees or rocks, and then how nature started reclaiming those traces as well, the way that they would kind of decompose. And this coalesced into an exhibition called As I Went Walking, which was really kind of examining the perimeter or the boundaries of property. And I'm not the first New Englander to be preoccupied with this. I was, I've reread Robert Frost's Mending Wall, and there are these themes of the relationship of oneself to the land that have much longer histories that I probably am a part of as a New Englander, but also as considering, where I am and the place and time in which I'm existing. And that's really been so central to my work throughout. These paintings led me to a body of work called On the Ground, where I started realizing that everywhere I looked, no matter where it was on the ground, there was something just absolutely full of wonder and mystery and information. And the more I looked, the more I saw. So again, this is a practice of being in person, not unlike traditional photography, of bearing witness to something that is right in front of me. And in that process of looking, I always tend to see more than meets my eye. This is a really extraordinary practice that has taught me a lot about the world. And by setting up somewhere and making a painting, I tend to attract visitors and learn through their eyes as well what it is that I'm painting. I've made these in different locations. However, this one, like the previous oil painting you saw, this is a painting of a single boundary marker on the corner of my property that I rotated around, painting it from different vantage points, and therefore also kind of trespassing in this as I kind of rotated around this axis of the boundary marker. These are, again, these paintings called On the Ground that were also, as I mentioned briefly, they had not just to do with place in the land, but also evidence of a place, a kind of registration of where one is. I was thinking about maps, the kind of ways in which we delineate or demarcate the land. And I was also thinking about how that gets translated through representation. I mean, maps, after all, are a form of two-dimensional representation. And I started to think a lot about, as many of us did, about in this kind of post-truth world or something, post-fact world, about how to verify experience, how to verify one's own kind of place and time. And is a practice that really does seek to foreground direct experience with something, I wanted to know, and I'm still curious about this, what ways, in addition to my own brush and the kind of perception that I take in of what I see, what ways are there to kind of verify what it is I'm looking at? So these are screen prints of coins that are on there, which typically are used in archaeology. You know, you might see them on a piece of granite to indicate, you know, particular patterning of the stone to show scale, or also in crime photographs to show scale. There were other ways in which I was doing this with the color chart. This is it's a reference to a color checker chart, which is used in photography to calibrate color. But in this case, these are the colors that I used to paint the interior painting of this rake in the soil. Here's a detail of it. The frame itself, or the grid, I should say, this dark brownish black grid is screen printed, and then the colors inside are painted. I made a number of these paintings in Cuba. This is in Matanzas, Cuba. This is one I made there. And again, you can see the demarcations on the edge to indicate scale and the colors that I used. I also included a date stamp and a thumbprint as a form of evidence of having been there as well. These are a couple installation shots from my exhibition at Sycamore Jenkins, my gallery in New York, where you can see some of these to get a sense of their size, you know, relative to the wall. And here are a couple of the paintings which are on view at Gaw Gallery now. This is, you can see the detail of the edge, another date stamp as well. This here has a screen print of the direction facing north to kind of orient oneself. And I was thinking, as I mentioned, about maps, but I was thinking, how does the painting get oriented or kind of translated to the wall? Where are you relative to this thing? The disorientation and orientation of one around a specific object or site. This is a detail of the surface. I'll talk a little bit about my process in a bit, but it's important that they are how they're painted, which is quite different from the initial few paintings that I showed you. These are painted with a water-based paint, which absorbs into the surface, and there's no body to the paint. It's really like handwriting, very notational, and more like drawing, I guess one could say. And in that it's immediate and that it's indelible. And that's very important because I want these to be exposed in a way, like in photography, and unfold over time and record time in that way. The great thing for me about working in this way, I can't take anything back. I can't wipe it away. And that leads to a certain accumulation of my own observations. This is a body of work I made after that, which will be on view beginning September 30th in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was the artist in residence at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and I painted her things, a number of her things. These are her dishes. And on the side, on the edge of this painting is a ruler of hers, which she had, it's a screen print of an image of a ruler of hers, which is this kind of pink, and that I replicated on the edge, again, as a kind of marking of registration, what it was I was looking at. In these surrounds or frames, or, you know, the literal surroundings of what it was that I was surrounded by, and I would take rocks or kind of organic material from wherever it was that I was working, and I would put it into the material ground of the painting. And when it dried, I would sand it down to expose the aggregate of this material as a kind of evidence or trace of the place where I made it as well. Like kind of providing a context for where the painting took place in a very abstract way. Of course, these are O'Keeffe skulls, And as I was making these paintings, I was thinking a lot about preservation of her memory, the lengths that a number of people have gone over the years to really, really thoroughly preserve her memory. It is pretty extraordinary, and the museum really celebrates that through the preservation of her things. So this was a chance to spend time with her things, and in a way, I think of them as paintings of the act of preserving her memory, more than paintings of her stuff, I suppose. But again, belongings, her belongings, and a sense of place come through. I also made a number of paintings in the surrounding area outside of O'Keeffe's houses at Ghost Ranch and Abiquiu. And these were in the region, a sign from a church. These were pottery shards from a pueblo nearby that has not been archaeologically preserved. So also thinking about where in culture we preserve civilizations or histories, cultures, memory, and where we don't. So it was really striking to see, on one hand, the efforts that go into preserving O'Keeffe's memory, and then the kind of absence of preservation efforts for the Native American Pueblo shards of pottery. This is a stone which appeared almost kind of etched like some kind of epitaph or some graffiti on a rock, but in fact it was really it was simply the cracks of the rock itself. So also, as you've probably seen so far, I'm interested in where language and painting intersect, and what is written and what is inscribed, and what kind of emerges through the objects I'm looking at, but also my paintings, is something that's of interest to me. And I believe this is the last image of this body of work. This is a pile of sticks, which I think of as being a kind of memorial portrait. I made this shortly after my father passed away last year, and this is it's funny how looking at something can reveal, like I said before, more than meets the eye. But it's just I'm so grateful to this practice because I can look at something and really feel something that is unrelated to the subject matter entirely. The sticks don't really have to do with my dad, but in so many ways they do. And I think that's something in painting that I really appreciate. It's something that I seek out in my own practice, is when the painting kind of becomes more than the sum of its parts. And why does that happen? And it's partially psychological, and it's partially sensual, and it's metaphorical, and etc. But this is kind of the place that I hope my work gets to through representation. I think that's perhaps more attainable through abstraction, but I'm not an abstract painter. I wanted to show you a little bit about the process to kind of illustrate how I made these, because it does provide meaning, I think, into the work. These are some samples of the ground that a colleague of mine, Danny Levin, helped me make. They are that's a tennis ball, my dog's tennis ball that we ground up. There's sand, etc., trying to see what worked and what didn't. These are the frames, the kind of multi-panel frames, and this is what it looks like when I first apply all the kind of site material and then end up sanding it down. These are samples of the rocks and minerals that I found near O'Keeffe's house, and I grind them up in the mortar and pestle, as you can see here. Pigment, which is used to color the surrounds, and mixing that up. And then screen printing. This is my colleague Colleen Kinslow, who is a great printmaker who helped teach me how to screen print these the coins that I showed you earlier. There's that image again. And here's a photograph of some of my palettes and how I, what it looks like when I make the paintings on site. Sometimes I have to build an easel to accommodate, the painting I'm making. The kind of logistics of it are definitely a part of the process. And so here's the finished painting, and here's a detail of it. So next, as I mentioned, the second part of this talk is related to Cape Cod and my own art education there. And this is, when I was a teenager. So I have more images I can also show if we have time, but this was a very critical part of my early art education. And now that I've shown you some recent bodies of work, I think you'll probably be able to understand how these experiences, early on have really shaped my work today. So this was a brochure from the 1999 workshop schedule for the Cape Cod School of Art. And here's a photo I found on the internet of the Hawthorne Art Barn, which I think is still at the end of Pearl Street, right at the bend there. And that's where I first took classes. Lois Griffel was running it, and I took classes with the Egleys, Cedric and Jeanette, and learned how to mix color. This is a painting of mine from around that time where we had colored blocks, like, offcuts of wood, 2x4s or whatever, and they were painted a color and then put into the daylight, and then we painted the planes of the wood based on the color of the light. This is not a great painting, but you can see how I was using the palette knife. And this is part of this history going back to a traditional way of painting, going back to Charles Hawthorne and then Henry Henchy, who many of you, I'm sure, are aware of, and then to Henchy's students like the Egleys, for instance. And it was in the mornings we would paint in Pearl Street. And this was only a few weeks in the summer that I did this, but it was very impactful. And in the afternoons, we would go to the beach and there'd be a model. And again, kind of only with a palette knife. And the idea is that you would paint the color of the light rather than the local color that you saw. I found these old notes that I had taken from that time. So I was taught, this is exactly what I remember. So first you learn color and then you apply the painting techniques. And I even have instructions to myself on how to open a French easel. Open the middle leg, brace it, pull side legs out, and how to oil the joints, etc. And a diagram of how to put out the colors. I also like this note. There is a lot of failure involved, which is something I tell my students today, and I also tell myself. This is a photograph I took of Cedric Egley doing a demonstration of a model. You can see he's using a brush, which I'm not sure I ever graduated to. I think I was still mixing colors with a palette knife. But it was really instructive to watch someone demonstrate, which when I went to Cooper Union hardly ever happened. So this was that was a whole other kind of art education. This was a painting from around that time, also still again with the palette knife. Also at that time, I have a couple of other influences who were very impactful. One was Simi Marilis, who has a gallery also on Commercial Street, and I worked for Simi, and she was an incredible mentor And this is a photograph of some of her work in the gallery in its early days. I also went to see this Egon Schiele exhibition at MoMA. Probably some of you saw that, or perhaps you did. But that was very important for me because it's how I ended up, I think, really kind of wanting to be in Europe. And indeed, several years later, I spent a year on a Fulbright Fellowship in Vienna, Austria. I was really interested in painting the figure for many years, which, has not appeared in my work, as an artist in school. I was so into Egon Schiele that I made a mosaic of a copy of an Egon Schiele painting. And this mosaic was actually part of a project that I did as part of a course that I co-taught with my history teacher, Don Baker at Nauset. And we had an amazing time making this course. We learned how to do blacksmithing and lost wax casting, fresco painting, egg tempera painting, and mosaics, and learned the techniques and did them. It was called Artists and Artisans. Anyway, he was very, very important to me. And also, I think, really important to mention at this time, really influenced my life and myself as an artist. Also, Bob Rice, who taught European art history, and European history. So seeing the Schiele show kind of fit into my interests at that time substantially. And here's something I found, which is life drawing from the Chatham Creative Arts Center. I did a lot of life drawing. I was really, much better. I could draw the figure in 1999 better than I could draw the figure now, I'm sure. And these were our models, and I was the coordinator of this particular drawing, a community drawing weekly sessions that we had. And I also did this at the Cape Cod Museum of Art and also at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum, where someone who I drew with there named Callaway Jones was also really influential. I believe he's since passed away. And here's a painting that was more about my interests and kind of not yet reconciling my what I was learning with what I wanted to paint. This is Tori Amos on the beach, but I thought I'd include it to show you that I was thinking about beginning to, think I wanted to make paintings of things that were happening in my own personal life. But most of the artwork I made at this time was really kind of school these kinds of learning how to paint. But this is one example where I really let loose. Here's a photograph of Provincetown that I took around that time that I thought I'd just end that section with. Now, so that's that. It's kind of that's only a half hour. So I have a few more images I could show. Leslie, do you think I should or shouldn't?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. So there's a lot between 1999 and 2007. As I mentioned, I went to Vienna. I lived in Vienna. I lived in New York for for many years, but I went to Cooper Union, and I could give a whole talk about Cooper Union and how important that education was. New York City and the at that time and everything I learned, but that's a separate lecture, which I have given before and could definitely do again. I went to graduate school at Columbia, and my education, I just want to mention briefly, after Provincetown and after Massachusetts, because I also took classes at the museum school in Boston with Barney Rubenstein, which was also really important. Again, a whole other separate talk. But from around 2007 is when I started making work that was kind of like what became my practice. And for quite a while, here, I think 8-9 years or something, I made paintings in a way that drew on all of this education I had. this is a kind of picture of some of those paintings, which you can see just as like a Google image search would of my name would probably show something like that. And I was, as I mentioned, kind of working in a more itinerant way. I would go wherever I had a residency or a friend or was just kind of curious. I didn't really have much of a home base for a while. So other than my gallery, which was great. So my work had a place to return to, but I was more or less kind of painting wherever I could. And I very early on, coming out of graduate school, I learned that I didn't want to make work thematically. I wanted to see what would, I wanted to find out what I was interested in through painting. And I would just go around until I saw something that caught my eye, or kind of what felt like making eye contact with me. And I would make a painting of it, usually over the course of a day, but sometimes longer, but always in relation to time. And many people think of my work as paintings in a day. And that is true for these years. They were always like a long exposure. And the reason why for me a day was a useful kind of unit of time was because that's usually when the paint dried, when it kind of congealed on the surface of the painting into a skin. And I couldn't really go back into it. So again, like photography, it felt like a certain kind of material exposure. And what emerged to me was a painting that was, a kind of replication of what it was I was looking at in some way, but one which I could take away with me, and one which gave the impression not just of the object, but of the day. So, for instance, these paintings that I made over these years were very important in that they materialized experience, and they provided this kind of hard fact of my own kind of soft encounter with something else. And the way the painting can remember is really interesting to me, and more so every day. But they kind of remembered these places and these things. This frequently also, many of the subjects that I painted no longer exist. This has a new luxury apartment building, which is built over it. This is a painting actually at my parents' shop, Rose Forge in Brewster. And really it was whatever I kind of encountered, as I mentioned, that seemed to return my own gaze, and what I saw in it, it kind of looked back at me. This show was called What Looks Back. I also started to realize that I could meet people outside my own circle or circles, and get to know them through painting. And that was really exciting, painting in different cultures or different geographies, and learning, as I mentioned earlier, about kind of local histories, different techniques, different kind of residues of past that were not my own. So getting to kind of get a glimpse of them through painting. And sometimes painting was a way to understand my own relationship to whatever was going on in my life. I was around this time, I had cancer, and I was also reflecting on what health meant to me. My painting somehow could be more of a, they could do things that I myself couldn't do. So again, the kind of amazing, like, metaphysical ways that this practice has such a life of its own. This, by the way, was an essay that I wrote about this object that I really wanted to paint, my interests had started to reveal themselves to me to include language, as I mentioned earlier, faces, post-industrial landscape, the environment, and artisanal kind of or craft traditions, which it turns out I was interested in. I learned that through painting. So this was something I clearly wanted to paint, but when I couldn't do it for a number of reasons. And when I returned, it was no longer there. It disappeared. And I wrote an essay about this experience because it's really kind of proof that when I can make a painting, it can hold something in perpetuity that otherwise is, on the brink of disappearance. Some of those histories are closer to me and some are further away. This was, for instance, my chalkboard in my classroom where I was teaching in Tennessee at the time. These were all of the traces of my own and my students' notations and writing and wiping away over the course of the semester. These were shutters. Each painting is a diptych with the interior and the exterior of the same shutter. And they were all from the same building and had been removed. And they showed kind of orientations to daylight and time passing through their particular, when they had been installed on this house. So having been removed, they showed the traces of the sun, the strength of the sun, and the time that they were there. Here are some details. These are these gravestones that were all belonged to the same family. This was located in the UK. Here you can get a sense of the surface. Again, my more recent work is more fresco-like in that it's painted in this indelible way that I shared with you. However, when I had been making oil paintings, they had kind of body to the paint like this. After this period, I made, this kind of decade-ish period of making paintings that were where I was traveling. The body of work I just showed you, the ones that really kind of foregrounded encounter and duration of typically a day. I started to make work that was becoming a little bit more that explored my interests in other ways, I guess is one way to say it. And I was really lucky that I had an opportunity to stretch beyond the practice that had become so reliable and so and so generous to me. So one thing was, painting representationally, I started to wonder what would happen if I described what I saw at exactly to scale. And I suppose I was thinking about this for a number of reasons. I was living in Europe at the time. And this, by the way, is a flood marker that measured the height of the Rhone River where I was working. And and I was interested in what is literal and what isn't, and how can the painting be, how can its kind of scale presence, how does that feel to a human body that encounters it? Maybe it's the way that the internet was obviously becoming, such a huge part of my life. But I started to wonder what the presence of a painting could do, what it did to me physically as a body in space. And scale seemed to be important in that regard. I made a number of paintings of around this time of architectural fragments, doors, and windows in particular. And this is when I was living back in Europe. I was living in Rome. And I made these paintings of a single window that were to scale with the window itself. And each was over the course of a night. And so, again, they were durational paintings. They were, these long exposure paintings. In fact, they had almost more to do with time in the way that I was finding myself making these concentric frames and going around, like almost like my hand was like the hand of a clock. And when I really hadn't intended this to be a kind of project or a series or something, but ultimately it was. And these show the kind of my changing perception over the course of all the nights that I painted these. I was struck by the differences as much as the similarities. So they chronicle my own what I notice and what I don't. You can kind of see as you go back, some of them have some of the same features or characteristics, and others kind of forget them or they become quite different. And that's what I had, and that's what this work kind of revealed to me. That led to a bigger project, which was about a year and a half's worth of work dedicated to these large scale sculptures. I was thinking about scale in new ways, and I made a body of work for Storm King Art Center, which is north of the city, and made essentially instruments that could calibrate our, a bodily relationship of scale to a natural one or to art itself. If anyone's been there, it's a very beautiful place. And there's this really, a collection of a lot of very monumental sculptures. So I was thinking, can I make a piece of art that actually helps me understand the scale of what it is I'm looking at? And these were hand painted. So this one was a yardstick, but it was 36 feet. This is a tree that was 24 feet directly opposite Barnett Newman's broken obelisk. And you can see that it really is a painting. This is actually on view at the DeCordova Museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts now. And this one functioned as a kind of sundial. And I suppose scale is, when I say how can I make art that helps me better understand scale, I think it's also happened at a time where scale is so out of whack for my own kind of comprehension of the world, whether it's global warming or violence. There's a kind of scale that is just so incomprehensible and overwhelming, and painting and making things is a way to give me a sense that I can kind of understand my place within the world and kind of calibrate my own understanding of the scale and scope of what's happening around me. That's part of an experience of looking at a painting for me. This led to incorporating measurement into my work and printmaking. These are screen prints, and this, you can probably tell, led into the work which I've been making, more recently, which I can go back to. So this is, when seeing the edge of the painting with these markings is really a way to, as I mentioned before, kind of register or calibrate what it is that I'm looking at with the wall that it's on, with the person who's looking at it, etc. So I think I'll stop there, and happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thank you, Josephine. That was incredible. I do have a couple of questions. I don't see any on our Facebook feed, but I have a couple of questions for you, if you're okay with that. Yes. Especially in the last portion where you were talking about scale, I noticed that the themes of both scale and memory come up a lot in your work and over the years that you've worked. So can you talk a little bit about how the scale of a painting impacts the memory and the memory making that you're creating while you're making the piece? And if you ever intentionally skew the scale so that you might then skew your memory going forward?
Yeah, I mean, early on, I would just kind of paint like something at a scale that I thought felt right, like, and sometimes it was bigger or smaller than what it was I was looking at, but very psychological. It's like architecture. You can remember a room to be huge or tiny depending on how you're feeling in that moment. So paintings operate for me exactly the same way. Might remember something to be, much smaller, much bigger based on my own kind of uh, memory of it. So it's very mysterious how that works. I think the psychology of it. I think the same could go for surface in the sense of touch. I mean, it's funny that we don't really change our size that much, like our hands or um, it might remain pretty much the same size for most of our lives. And touch is such an important part of painting. So what that does to kind of uh, calibrate our understanding of how something was made or that someone else touched it is a very powerful sense of connection that I think is really hard to replicate in a digital space. It's something that paintings I think do especially well in person. And so I suppose simply put, like I've been making work that really rewards an in-person experience of viewing. The more recent work that has some of the ground and the minerals and the materials in it also include micaceous powders and materials that are shimmery and catch the light in different ways. And I want them to be really sensual in person and really reflective in that way. Also, as they kind of reside in the mind or in the memory as this kind of almost, a way of remembering more of a sense of something.
Well, I think it's interesting what you say about that because especially with the O'Keeffe paintings that you did of her things in her house, I think that there were a couple of those that were really, really three-dimensional, like the ones of the cups in the cupboard. But then it's so interesting that you put the ruler on the side because you are taking the three-dimensional side and putting the two-dimensional side, like making the two-dimensional side three-dimensional and making the three-dimensional side two-dimensional. It's kind of like you're giving your viewer a little gift and saying, this is actually a painting and it's flat, but you can, but even so, because when you have the image of it straight on, it looks so like it's so deep. But then when you have it to the side, it's just, and you show that ruler, it's such a different experience.
That's right, exactly. And it is that kind of illusion through that is it is something kind of uncanny that happens in my work and something I think about a lot. Also, in my oil painting, something similar happened earlier on, I think, where up close they looked really different than they did far away. At what point did they coalesce into an image? Of course, digital images have completely changed that. Now they're just very, hashtagable kind of. But I think that sense of kind of uncanniness of like depth perception or scale relationships. And this is really subtle stuff. This is on the same par of like a hunch or a sensation or like feeling like, something more spiritual, I would say. It's kind of, it's my frequency is a little bit more along those lines, I suppose, that I'm trying to kind of use is too strong of a word, but like explore through an artistic practice, give space for those feelings to kind of exist and thrive and feel like they're important and not to just be bypassed.
And which is why it's so important to embody the same space as a work of art that you're experiencing.
Right. In much the same way, almost like a parallel to my own practice. So if I have to be there in front of something, someone else should be there in front of the painting. Yeah, ideally.
Right. Just before we sign off, I have one more question. Can you just talk a little bit about the newer work that you had? Can you talk a little bit about the framing process and the way that you put the image on the canvas and the colors that you chose for the ground?
Yeah, so that is so as I showed you in the back, there are two panels. There's the painting inside that's inlaid into a frame, which is kind of like a surrounding area for it. And I was thinking about photography, like the kind of formats of photography where you have an image and then maybe a 35 millimeter slide or or Polaroid or something which has this margin. But I was also thinking about marginalia as a kind of the stuff around it, the context, the edges, and which all made sense with boundaries and edges of things, beginnings and endings, and a lot of my interests. So, and the color was really meant to just kind of almost like hold the painting like a frame, but suspend it and kind of enrich the painting itself, along with the site material that ended up being included. One time I made one where the site material was the same exact color as the surround. So I redid that so that can be visible. So it didn't always work out the first time, and they actually get quite pale the more I sand them. So they start out very, very bright, almost like I'm shocked. And then as I sand them and they go down, they get much paler and kind of recede. I wanted something that was like partially painting and partially wall, partially painting and partially site, something that was like almost like a buffer zone or a zone of translation. This is pretty conceptual stuff. I mean, I think it's a way of working that is sculpture, it is photography, it is printmaking, it is painting. It's very hybrid.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you glaze pottery before it goes in the kiln, it's so dark, and then when it comes out, the color is much more muted.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
So maybe it's got some pottery techniques in there too.
Exactly. I've never been good at pottery though. Whenever my stuff has come out, it's been bubbled and cracked.
All right. Here's a question that I see on our Facebook chat. Philip asks, do the paintings that were created as a series, the shutters, the glass cabinet door painted in Rome, need to be seen together as a series, or do they exist comfortably individually outside in the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this is why I love solo exhibitions, and I think something else that is harder and harder to come by, but I am maybe old-fashioned in this. I really love solo exhibitions. I love the relationships between works of art, and I like working serially. This has also been amplified by my interest in printmaking and working serially or in an iteration. So yeah, they really do benefit from being alongside one another. And as you probably saw with this format, as I was just talking about with the surrounds, it's a consistent format that I've had for a number of years now that is important for me.
We have one more question. Heather is asking you to speak a little bit more about the surrounds. She says, the work in the gallery at the beginning, I am interested in how clean the surround is, and then in parentheses she writes contained, compared to how organic the sections of the ground are. Could you please speak to that?
Totally. I completely agree. I mean, it's amazing with the ground. Like I mentioned this to Susanna Fulcher, who wrote for the Provincetown Independent, but it's just like I literally could look anywhere at any patch of ground, and it's just as interesting as another one. And that sense of containment is definitely felt from the surrounds more. And I think it's, I think of it maybe not so much as contained, but as held or suspended, of like celebrated. My work definitely deals with, the overlooked and the everyday, as you mentioned in your intro, Leslie. And I want something as banal as the ground. Well, it's not banal. I mean, that's the thing. It's like there's no patch of ground that isn't like thoroughly complex with the history of ownership or of colonization or of nature. It's just there's so much wherever you look. So I wanted to kind of see what could happen if I took a very small section of the ground and gave it, the time of day and celebrated that. And in that sense, I hope that the surrounds kind of support that and give it a sense of maybe not containment, but there is that kind of preservation impulse in the work that I've started to really notice ever since making the O'Keeffe work as well. So it is, kind of like an archaeological study where I'm treating it very sensitively, literally brushing, the surface of it as if it was, something to really remember.
Yeah, that was great. Oh, here's another one. Can you speak to the nexus in your paintings where the factual observation meets the personal had painting / note-taking? There is a quality of just the facts, including being true to scale, and there is a personal syntax to the mark-making gestures that are uniquely individual to the painter. How do you think about the meeting of the objective and the subjective?
Wow, that's such a great question. Who asked that?
Yeah, it's Philip again.
Wow, thank you.
Really great question.
That's amazing. That's literally how I think about this work. I'm really pleased that this is coming through. Yeah, I mean, again, this kind of post-fact world, if I think about this, how do you give a kind of truthful account of experience? And a photograph no longer functions as true, if it ever did. I don't know. And what kind of records do exist? How do we know? And I think it's a big claim to make, so I'm not really there yet, but truth, capital T or something. But I will say that fact is something. There is a material facticity to a painting that cannot lie. And paintings just don't lie very well. And I like that about them. I like the way that they are what they are. Everything's on the surface for you to see. And you can't hide behind that. And so that kind of blend of the objectivity of the surround with the site material combined with my own subjective touch and perception, I hope gives an account that is that brings together a fuller picture or a fuller truth or something of time and place. And I've been increasingly interested in reportage for that reason. The kind of techniques of journalism, note taking, as Philip mentioned as well, field notes. What makes it in, and how do you kind of do it in this unedited way? Again, that kind of indelibility of how I'm painting too. These are all things that are all kind of swirling around in my head as an artist, and they've started to come out in my work. I think I've got a ways to go with it, but that's exactly where I'm at in my thinking.
And I think that also speaks to the memory piece that you were talking about before, and creating those memories.
That's right. And how do you memorialize something? How do you remember something in a full way? Thank you, Philip, for being so attentive and perceptive.
Well, thank you very much. I think that is it for us. Thank you so much, Josephine. We're so happy that you joined us. And thank you so much, everyone watching, for joining us tonight. Please mark your calendar for our next lecture on July 27th with Francis Olszewski and Mike Carroll discussing Francis's exhibition at PAAM. Good night.
Thanks.